Gone are the days of 2007, 2008, when Western companies were viewed almost on a pedestal in mainland China, and they can get away with a lot of things that perhaps were not offering the best value to Chinese consumers.
Hello and welcome. I am your host Pritish Sanyal, and you're listening to the 1% Project. Conversations that will help you understand how some of the smartest minds build, scale, and implement new ideas and ventures. If you enjoy these conversations, do share and subscribe. My very first guest is an ex-colleague, Robert Howe, the co-founder and COO of Hype Asia. Hype is an Asian venture builder that helps startups build, operate, and scale across Asian markets. He's presently heading the expansion of GOAT into China. GOAT is the world's largest sneakers marketplace. He was also the business operations and strategy head for Airbnb China. We kick this conversation off with Robert, asking him about his China immersion.
My kind of relationship with China started in 2005, 2006. I had a really interesting kind of upbringing because, as most Chinese people, they tend to immigrate to America. I actually was born and raised in America, but then immigrated to China. And I went to China in the junior year of my high school. So I actually spent the last 2 years of high school in China. And that was around 2005, 2006. There, actually, at the end of my high school years, because it was, I got to see it from a different lens. It was a really interesting time period because I got to witness and not just observe, but also participate in the economic growth and the kind of the evolution of the country and the cities and also the people. My fascination with China started not just as like a young person, but also as a budding entrepreneur. And immediately after school, I was doing a lot of different projects and trying to find ways to leverage my capabilities of bridging the East and the West. So I think it started there.
You set up Airbnb China in 2013. How was that experience? And if you had to do that now, would you do things differently?
Yeah, I did. I joined Airbnb really early in, I think, May 2012. And I joined their Hong Kong office at that time. And our mission was to bring Airbnb into Asia. But my primary focus was to bring Airbnb into China. At that time, globally, they probably only had 150 some employees, if I remember correctly. It was a tremendous learning experience. I was with them for over 5 years. No one knew in the first 2 years, from 2012 to 2014, no one knew if this was going to actually work. But I got a lot more confidence that Airbnb will work in China after I spent a full year in China just talking to hundreds and hundreds of guests as well as hosts. It became very apparent very quickly that China was going through this travel revolution. Chinese people were just beginning to explore the world and leave the country in 2012, 13, and 14. And that was our entry. That was our angle. That's how Airbnb became super successful in China.
And would you do it differently if you had to launch Airbnb now in 2020?
I think in every business I've launched, there's a lot of things that we can do differently. I think one thing that we might have underestimated from the beginning, and I think a lot of foreign companies entering China also do this, they underestimate their competition. They underestimate how well the local market reacts and kind of consumes local products from local competition and local companies compared to how local consumers consume, engage with Western products. Gone are the days of 2007, 2008, when Western companies were viewed almost on a pedestal in mainland China. And they can get away with a lot of things that perhaps were not offering the best value to Chinese consumers. And they can get away with that because Chinese consumers didn't have alternative options. They didn't have better options from Chinese companies. But that environment, that landscape has changed fundamentally. Chinese companies are providing the right value, the right services to Chinese, and many times much better than foreign companies.
So is building a venture now in China for international companies more difficult?
If we're talking about technology companies, let's say companies that rely on social networks, rely on e-commerce channels, selling a particular product, or even a SaaS business, there are some things that have become easier. Let me talk about those first. Those are infrastructure related. And then the things that have become more difficult is, again, competition. So starting with infrastructure, gone are the days where Western companies need to speak to half a dozen different law firms and then find creative solutions for setting up a WOFE or setting up a bank account in China. These structures, these corporate structures are pretty robust now. The Chinese government has made it incredibly much more simple for foreign companies to operate, fund themselves in mainland China. So I think from that perspective, the barrier to entry has come down significantly. In terms of actually succeeding in China or even beating Chinese competition, that's different. That has become more difficult. I think Chinese consumers have evolved, their consumer behavior has evolved increasingly quickly, and their needs, their service, the service requirements for Chinese consumers have increased. Their expectations have increased. So that's why it's difficult for foreign companies to move as quickly as local companies to service those needs.
You are the GM for Goat in China. So how has that experience been?
Wow, we entered the market officially in July of 2019. So Goat is the world's largest marketplace for sneakers. More recently, we actually expanded our collection to reselling sneakers, apparel, and accessories. So we started in Los Angeles, and now we're a global business. China is actually the first international office. It's actually a full office. So we have engineering, product, as well as all the front end business units you may imagine: marketing, sales, business development. So yes, I am the general manager for Goat in China. My primary mission was to expand them from North America into China, to turn China into a demand marketplace. So facilitating and helping Chinese consumers to purchase Goat products easier in a more simplistic way. Before we entered this market, we found that Chinese consumers were already going on Goat to buy shoes. And it was because of that impetus and because of that signaling, we felt that there's a lot of opportunity here. And of course, there's already a lot of Chinese competition in this space as well.
You have been there since the very beginning of COVID-19 pandemic.
So on the day of COVID being announced, I think it was around January 23rd or 24th, I actually left China on January 18th to go back to San Francisco area. And I flew back to Shanghai on February 15th or 16th. It was during that time period that China really cracked down. They got a late start in Wuhan, which was the epicenter. But then as soon as February turned around, they really turned it up a notch and locked down the city. I have a lot of friends in Wuhan who were affected by the lockdown and still are actually unable to return. In general, if I had to sum up a few bullet points, I think the whole nation has rallied around the frontline staff in Wuhan to really support them, right? Mentally, emotionally, and also through donations. The second thing is that everybody's very supportive of these extreme measures of controlling the virus spread. And I think it's paid dividends because now we've recovered from it very quickly to the point where in Shanghai, my entire 50-person team was able to return back to the office nearly 3 weeks ago. Environment in Shanghai, it just so happens Shanghai had it under control really well from the beginning. And life is really much back to normal in Shanghai. So I think the rest of the world may call some of the measures taken here more draconian, but I think I see it as more necessary.
And how technology has played a role in this, because there was a lot of news in international media that different tech firms are really trying new things out.
I think really a lot of this is manual. A lot of the control truly was manual. The central government communicates provincial government, provincial government communicates city government. City government has many different arms in which they can use as levers to execute their plans. As an example, every apartment building here has security guards, and those security guards have a direct phone number, are directly reachable by the city police or the district police that are in charge of that thing. So when the Wuhan people are to be released and can travel away on April 8th, when they reach the airport, they must give the phone number of they must give the address of their home in Shanghai. And the Wuhan people, the government would actually call the security guards and make sure and give them a heads up that this person's returning. And the security guard must call the Wuhan department back once the person arrives. So this is an example of how far-reaching the executional help is in Shanghai. Whereas I don't see that happening in where I'm from, in Bay Area, California, because there's simply nobody that can check in on anybody when you return back to your neighborhood or your home.
Yeah. Yep. And do you see China to be a different nation post the COVID-19 pandemic?
Ironically, if I were to rewind a month ago, I would say yes, because I did not know how COVID-19 is affecting Western countries like North America and parts of Europe. But now that I've seen how it is affecting North America and Europe, I would say relatively, I don't see China being as affected as these other countries. Unemployment numbers here aren't really public knowledge. They don't really announce these numbers. But just from personal experience and anecdotal evidence, very little businesses have been impacted. I think SMEs have been impacted to a degree, but the government has really stepped up to help these people. So you don't really hear about millions and millions of people going unemployed in China, whereas I do in North America.
Cool. Now getting back to something much more on a lighter note and talking about Chinese technology, right? You really have the best of both worlds. San Francisco, been in China over more than 10 years plus. Has Chinese technology evolved, and is it really better than the Western world?
It's really interesting. I love this question, and I can talk a lot about it, and I really love to hear your thoughts too. So my older brother is also in investments, and he works in North America, and he works for a large private equity firm, and they do a lot of high-tech investments, primarily into renewable energy. And what I do is I work with startups, helping them go from the Valley most of the time into China. There's stark differences to how we see investment opportunities, and there's stark differences to how we see and define the word startups and technology companies. Let me give some examples. So in China, in the last 10 years, a lot of the companies that we've seen today grew so significantly, scaled so much out of consumer necessity, out of the hierarchy of needs that they needed to access a variety of consumer goods, everything from toiletries to microwaves to refrigerators, and then later on to shoes, and then to things that you may not need, but outside of necessity. And Alibaba provided the perfect platform for it. When Alibaba first launched, you got to remember, people had a very little lack of trust for one another. So how can I digitally give you money and then you give me product? Doesn't work. So they created Alipay, in which it's a digital escrow where I give him the money, Alipay the money, and Alipay acts as an escrow between the two parties. Then you had things like all the social networks, WeChat, people were being connected to one another for social needs. Then you had mobility needs, scooters, bicycles. Then you had car needs for also mobility. Just anything related to consumer needs spurred the startup environment, spurred the technology movement in China. But America also went through that journey. But they didn't go through it the same time China went through it. They went through it 20 years earlier, in the late 90s and the early 2000s, perhaps even earlier, with PayPal. You remember, that was a 1990s company. eBay, a 1990s company. Apple. So when I think about technology companies, West and East now, and when I say West, I'm primarily referring to North America, it's so different because China is still very much building products and value-added services for consumers. And those consumers are at the beginning of their consumption needs. Whereas in America, a lot of the consumers, their consumption needs are super mature. So what comes after that? Well, that's where my brother comes in. That's where he starts investing into things like renewable energy, into changing the conductors within batteries from lithium ion to silicon. to investing into autonomous driving so that you can reduce human need in trucking and all these amazing, amazing things. So I would say innovation exists on both sides, but we are still very much, in China at least, we're still very much on the basic needs of consumers, and the West has evolved past that.
Brilliant. And I think the consumer journey of a Chinese customer is so different from the West. You can actually use a product, a Chinese app, almost 2/3 the way without registration. You can really experience it, go multiple steps. But if you look at a Western app, you need to sign up the first button you press and put in your email address and so on and so forth. The way you pay for, let's say, blogs, in China, you can pay by words, so you can pay by a page. The consumption and monetization patterns are very different.
Yeah, absolutely.
My next question, what did TikTok do that Snapchat didn't?
Sorry to disappoint you. I don't know too much about TikTok, but I'll just share with you what I do know. My first impressions is I was never a user of Snapchat, and I'm not a user of TikTok, but I do see a lot of the TikTok equivalent in China, which is Douyin, or it's the same company, but the China version. I think TikTok was really interesting because they acquired Musical.ly to get started, and Musical.ly was a US-based company, but started by Chinese founders. And they made a lot of headway into the teenage, preteen to teenage to university area. And I think they captured that consumer audience very, very well. I would say that product superiority is a big thing when it comes to streaming, when it comes to video recording. And so it was really amazing to see a Chinese company play in North America and compete with Snap, because China was able to adapt and move and launch new products and do maybe many multiples or times the A/B tests that an American company was in their own backyard, and then ship those product changes to Americans faster than Snap could. So if they could offer a better product experience, a better user experience to this very targeted segment of the US consumer population, then I think it would be inevitable for them to win.
Another question in this same space. Meituan is a late entrant into the tech space in China, but it has grown into almost an equivalent of a WeChat or the other big players. What kind of white space did they see, and how did that success happen?
Many years ago, Meituan acquired a company called Dianping, and today they're called Meituan Dianping. And Dianping was an aggregator for food reviews, so different restaurant reviews and whatnot like that. So think about you were Meituan when you acquired Dianping on day one. On that day, you realize that Baidu owned search. You realize that Tencent owned social communications in big part of payments, and Alibaba owned e-commerce as well as payments. So at that point, if you're Meituan, you don't want to do search, you don't want to do social communications, and you definitely don't want to do e-commerce. So how else can you own consumers? Because that's the whole point. If you're going to create a super app, you want to be able to create a platform in which you can say, I own Chinese consumers. And the funny thing is that the consumers that Tencent and Alibaba and Baidu own are the same consumers. They all overlap. That Venn diagram has a massive circle in the middle. So if you are Meituan Dianping, what other service can you provide to become the fourth circle? And the answer, or at least what they thought the answer was, and it was very successful, was daily services beyond shopping needs. Okay, so everything from, well, you have to eat. So if you're going on restaurants, then it would be like Open Table or Open Rice in Hong Kong, but just done really, really well, and have 90% coverage, so that anytime you want to find where to eat, you go to Meituan. And then once you own that user, that city user, because all the restaurants are in the city anyways, not in the rural, then what do? Well, then I start offering them other services such as car sharing. And now they're a huge aggregator for car sharing. And then what do? Well, they did biking. They have a huge bike thing now, ride sharing, because you already own the consumer. And they just start breaking into payments, because since they own the restaurant, they can offer discounts and promotions and just ask their consumers to pay the restaurant through the app. Yeah. So they started with this concept of I need to own the daily lives of consumers. And then they grew it. That's what happened.
Brilliant. So that brings us to our last question. What are your views about Chinese tech in the next 10 years? Like, how do you see it evolving?
I think of it in different dimensions. So maybe one dimension is I do see that investments into entrepreneurs, first-time founders, second-time founders, leveraging some sort of technology to better the lives of Chinese citizens, that trend is only going to increase.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm really happy about that. In fact, if you go to the west of Beijing, the Silicon Valley of Beijing, you go to any apartment building, you'll probably find a couple entrepreneurs per flat. Like if you go into any apartment building, any level, there'd be a couple entrepreneurs. I think that's really exciting because it provides an alternative to regular work, and it also provides job opportunities to Chinese citizens. The next dimension, I think, is I see the trend of offering or solving consumer needs to continue. I don't see that not continuing, right? And it's only going to evolve because we've definitely not hit the tipping point. And what that means founders and companies are still fighting for the wallet. They're still fighting for Chinese people's money, their purchasing power, their consumer consumption power. I don't know how long that will go on for. So I don't see any, like talking about renewable energies, talking about solar panels, all that stuff. I think that's much later. And then on the back of that second point of targeting consumers, you're going to have fintech companies trying to also ride off that wave. So as consumer consumption increases, purchasing should increase. So making it easier, making it safer, making it faster for people to pay. Yeah, maybe a third dimension is Western tech companies have becoming increasingly less competitive in mainland China. Even though it's becoming easier for them to set up, it's becoming harder for them to operate and harder for them to win. So it does make me question whether or not Western companies can cut it in mainland China. Of course, it depends on how that company defines success in China. There are many, many successful joint ventures. There are many successful Western companies here in traditional industries like car manufacturing and whatnot, luxury. But specifically for technology companies, it's to be seen.
Thank you, Rob. It was great speaking to you, and thanks for your time.
Thank you, Pritish. Pleasure.
You can find the show notes for this episode and every other episode on 1%.live. If you enjoyed this conversation, share it on social media and leave a review. See you next time.